Thank you for joining the Imperfection Wellness podcast. In today's episode, we have part 2 of a conversation with Oosh and me about Possley's paradigm, and it runs over to about 70 minutes, and so I'm going to break it up into 2 parts. So for part 2, this is part 1 of part 2, and thank you for listening, and as always, wishing you the best on your wellness journey. Listeners, Scottie and Oosh are back for part 2. Hello, Oosh.
Hello, I'm so excited for this session. The coach gets coached. Like, how cool is that?
You have been my cheerleader and pushing me out of my comfort zone. And I think it's great that you embraced the paradigm and wanted to
Yeah.
talk about it and go through a scenario. And so, just so you know, everyone's on the same page, Possley's paradigm is 9 concepts. It's 9 concepts to help you get unstuck from those thoughts or those belief patterns. And you can download it now. So, imperfectionwellness.com, go to Possley's paradigm. And Usha is here to talk through a scenario that many of us have. And I'll
Mm.
kind of let her open up with what she's willing to share. But I thank you for the vulnerability and for helping me guide you, but also give an example to listeners of how do we use the paradigm. And when you and I talked about this a few weeks back, and you said, I think people probably understand it, but maybe they don't know how to apply it. Let's go
Mm.
through a scenario. I was really taken aback and appreciation because I think you're right, Oosh. I've talked about this for months now, and people are like, oh, good for you. And how does it apply to me? So, what was your
Yeah.
thought when you had this idea and looked at the paradigm?
Yeah. I think for me, knowing, and again, when I coach people, if we say that, there's this paradigm, we almost go, oh, it's too much, right? We go, it's too hard. I'm in my own head. I really don't know how to get out of my thoughts. And then when I actually looked at your paradigm, I thought, oh, actually, it's not that complicated. Like it makes sense. So I think we go in with this preconceived idea that it's going to be all too hard. And then I was like, oh, well, why don't we actually just use a real life scenario for me and go through that paradigm and actually just show your audience that it really isn't that hard. And it just takes that little bit of effort to go through it. And I think we spoke about it last week that it takes as much effort to stay in the discomfort as it does to work on something. So why don't we shift that into a positive bias and use that energy to work on it?
I want to follow up with that. I like the way you framed that. It takes as much energy to work through the discomfort as it does to sit in it. And I think that's huge for people because step 1, and we'll get to the paradigm in a moment, but step 1 is awareness of the paradigm. But it's that awareness of I sit in my discomfort and I fight it so hard that it's
Mm.
so second nature. I don't even question it. I don't even know what's happening because I'm so used to it. And all that energy it takes. And
Yes.
why do we overshop? Why do we overdrink or overindulge? Or why can't we sleep? Why are we nervous and anxious? Because we're fighting the discomfort. And so, as you and I both know as meditation teachers, when we let this discomfort come up, yes, it feels uncomfortable, but it passes. It passes through. So I love that you brought that point up.
Mm.
Great. Well,
Mm.
why don't we go ahead and get started? And again, I think, obviously you and I briefly talked about what you were going to share, but I think it's something that many people feel. And at one point in my career, I definitely have felt it, at
Mm.
different times. And so, what would you like to kind of share with people today and kind of talk through the paradigm?
Yeah. So reflecting on, I guess, not only giving the scenario that's real, but also something I think is going to be relatable to your audience is this concept of this inner critic that we have. So it's almost like we know it, our logical mind knows we can do something, and we start taking action, but then there's this quiet voice that's behind the logic that's telling you you're not good enough, it's not going to happen, you don't deserve it, success is for other people but not for you. um, and I felt that really creeping up for me, even though I've done so much work on this. But now that I've qualified like yourself as a meditation teacher, and I'm almost having to rebrand myself away from this corporate coach to this almost, spiritual, energetic, work that I want to do. And part of me is like, like I believe in myself. I know I can do it from a competence point of view, but there is this inner voice that's coming up that's going, well, no, you're not good enough. So I thought, you know what, just as I'm about to rebrand my website and really put myself out there to the world, I thought this would be a perfect coaching session for myself as well. And I'm sure, like I said, mine is related obviously to the business, but this inner critic concept, like you said, everyone has that voice. It's just how loud is it, and how much do we really listen to it?
I love that. And I'm going to add two things and feel free to disagree. I think also sometimes people think, oh, if I am successful, what's waiting around the corner to pull the rug out from underneath me and have everything crash? So I can't even enjoy my success. So there's
Yeah.
that. And then two, what I've really been learning the past few weeks and kind of diving into the study is we look at success as outcomes. And what we need to start doing is looking at our success as process. You and I
Mm,
are successful because we're here on this podcast today, period. Whether it's
yeah.
one listener, 100 listener, 100,000 listeners, that's pure outcome, and that doesn't matter. And that's ego, and we're going to talk about that
Mm,
first. And so as we're looking at this, I think it's beautiful that with this example and kind of piggybacking, but keeping with you, I do share that. I do have that inner critic that's like, who do you think you are?
yeah.
Having a podcast, writing a book, being a meditation teacher. And so, as you and I are both going through this, thank you for sharing your vulnerability. And I think it ties in beautifully with what I want to introduce as one of the first concepts, kind of a vocabulary definition before we go into the paradigm, is ego.
Mm,
And our ego is needed. So first and foremost, we need our ego. Our ego's not the enemy, but we need to be aware of what the ego does. The ego, from an evolutionary standpoint, is protective in nature. It gives me that I, that me, that mine. This is mine. And what it does is in protecting us and trying to keep us safe, along with our autonomic nervous system, our fight or flight, our rest and digest, our ego is going to try to keep us safe. What's my group? Who has my back? And what happens is when we look at ego, it can take us down a couple different paths. So when I look at the ego, I think of it in a couple different ways. And one of them is the overcompensating ego. And the overcompensating ego is just as scared as the undercompensating ego, but it's trying to overachieve in order to compensate for the fear. Then I think there's the everyday ego, I call it, which is just you don't really notice whether you're over or undercompensating. You're kind of just going on an autopilot, but you still have kind of a subtle fear. And then the undercompensator. And I lived as an undercompensator, meaning my ego said what you were talking about. You're not good enough. You can't do this. Who do you think you are? And it kept me small. And by keeping me small, it thought it was keeping me safe. And if you're at that nth degree of being a narcissist, it's falsely making you bigger. That makes you think that you're safe, but it's all these patterns are coming from a place of fear because the ego's trying to understand where do we go. So when it
yeah.
sends us a message of we're not good enough, it's basically trying to protect us. There's nothing wrong with that. The thing that happens is when you're aligned with what you're doing with rebranding, with being a meditation teacher, you're doing new things. And as you're doing new things, the ego's like, don't do new stuff, shrink, be small. And
Yeah.
so this concept ties in to concept one of the paradigm. And when you look at the paradigm, you start wherever you want to, but we become aware. We become aware that we will always have these egoic thoughts, thousands of thoughts a day, and we are separate from our thoughts. And so the biggest thing, the biggest takeaway that I always say to people, if you get nothing else out of the paradigm, it's bring your awareness to I am separate from my thoughts, feelings, and emotions. While I have them, I'm separate from them. And the rest of the concepts help you kind of create that separation. So I'm going to pause there and say, what are your thoughts on ego awareness and kind of your feedback?
I definitely agree with the two levels of ego and how you described it. And I think mine is definitely how you classed it as under. And I think you're right about fear. That really hits home, that word, because it's almost like, well, if I don't put myself out there, then I can't fail, right? So it's
Yes.
almost like this protection mechanism. And then I go, well, no, but I do want to put myself out there. But then what if it doesn't happen in the way that I want it to happen? So I think it's that awareness of removing, those, expectations. I guess one thing, what you said around the awareness, I think logically I know that I am not my thoughts, but how do I actually separate it? Like I know it. When you say it, I go, yeah, of course I am not my thoughts. But at moments, I feel really connected to them.
Absolutely. And so that'll kind of, as we kind of go in
Yeah.
order, and we will follow in order,
Right.
knowing again that there is no technical order, but for the
Yeah.
experiment here and the discussion here, the next thing I want to talk about is attachment.
Mm.
And what happens is when we are still, even though we're aware that we're not our thoughts, we still feel like we are. And then what happens is we inadvertently attach our self-worth to our thoughts.
Yeah.
So you just described it yourself. You have a successful EQ business, you're consulting, you've been doing this. How many years have you been doing this?
8 years now.
8 years. Where were you 8 years ago when you first started? You probably had those same feelings.
Yeah.
Now, 8 years later, you're like, I got this. Even if I'm having an off day, I got this.
Mm.
Suddenly now you're starting anew. And
Yeah.
your ego comes in and says, your worth is tied to your attachments of here's my successful business that could change. Here's all these variables. And what happens is this attachment to things, to people, to ideas, we don't realize how attached we are. Through that attachment, if we're not aware, our self-worth is going to move around. And so then you start questioning, you're like, who am I to be doing this? And
Mm.
you kind of again start reattaching to this fear-based model. How do you get rid of attachment? You sit and you become aware. You start by being aware. You can also skip ahead, which we're not going to do, but you can also skip ahead to being the observer, but we'll get there in a moment. But the one thing I say with attachment is just be aware there are certain things. Let's say you get a new car, and in a couple years, and that new car gives us that great feeling. My self-worth is great. I can afford this new 2024, or maybe it's the 2025 hybrid pure electric number one car. And when people see me driving down the road, they know I've made it. And then your car disappears. It gets
Mm.
stolen, it gets old, it ages, it gets dented. What happens? Well, let's take that car and look at physical beauty. When we are attached to concepts about ourselves, to our beliefs, what happens to beauty that fades? And I'm putting fades in, bunny ears, parentheses. Beauty doesn't fade, but in our society, when that starts changing, when we age and we're attached to this concept, our self-worth starts shrinking because now the bright, new, shiny object, whether it's a person, an item, is no longer bright and shiny. So same thing goes back. I want to tie this back into what we were talking about with your company. Now you have a new endeavor with Loka, with your meditation, with your wellness. And it's like, oh, but my foundation is this last 8 years. So for right now, bring your awareness to the fact that there is some egoic attachment because your rock foundation is changing.
Mm. And I think when you say, this awareness to then bring the detachment, are you saying to sit with the discomfort? Because there is that element of discomfort in the shift. It's almost like you got one foot in and one foot out into the old and the new. And there is this discomfort until you rebrand yourself and until you put yourself out there and until you get yourself known and clients come in. So what do you suggest to do with sitting with that discomfort?
That was not a leading question, but it turned into a leading question because it automatically ties in to the next concept,
Awesome.
which is acceptance. We sit in acceptance of everything that is present moment, everything that was past, and everything that will be future. And when we sit in acceptance, we are sitting with the discomfort of everything is as it is because that's how it is. And I know that sounds ridiculous, but if we just sit in total acceptance, how did I get to sitting at this podcast with you today? And if I look at all the events that led up to this, one or two things could have aligned that you would have turned left instead of right, and I would have gone a different direction. And we could have easily not ended up in the same teacher training course together. So
Yeah.
many things lined up the way that they did. So we sit in acceptance. Now, it's easy to do that when things are going well. When is it hard to sit in acceptance?
When there's discomfort.
When
So
something,
when you say,
yes.
yeah, so when you say sit in discomfort, I'm going to put it down to the practical. So that is literally sitting, physically sitting or standing, whatever that means, and accepting the feelings that come. Now, if stories come and thoughts come while I'm logically trying to sit in acceptance, do I just let them come or do I just try and push them away?
So this is an interesting podcast for me because I've lived these concepts
Mm,
so long now that they
mm,
merge together.
mm.
And so what happens is as we sit in acceptance and feel that discomfort and it starts coming up, we can start now not going in order. And that's why the paradigm doesn't follow in order. So if
Yeah.
we want to skip around, we can do a couple of things.
Mm,
We can go to the next concept, which is be the observer, or
yeah.
we can go to lean in and let go.
Yeah.
And for purposes here, sticking close to order, now we move into be the observer. And that's why I appreciate that you said in the beginning, when you hear the word paradigm, you're like, oh, is that another, like, what hokey thing is this guy trying to sell? Trying to sell nothing. It's free. It's free on my website. Like,
And I think it's just tools, right? Like
it's a
I
tool.
call it almost like tools and like a roadmap, like a methodology of if I'm feeling this, what's that next logical right action that I can take? Which I think is really key because sometimes we can get lost in that overwhelm of I don't know what to do. And I think that's
Yes,
why this point is really important to go. Again, I get what you're saying is sit in acceptance. And even now, when you're saying that, and I'm going, okay, I can sit in acceptance that I'm going to have to rebrand, that my business will shift. But as I'm saying that and I'm in acceptance, my inner critic is running on this treadmill really quickly. And
absolutely. And it's
and
running
it's
fast.
like,
It's running faster and faster.
yeah, and it's like, do I observe the thoughts on the treadmill or do I push that so that it fucking gets off the treadmill?
Mm-hmm.
Like, where do we go with that? Because I think there's a misconception that we have to sit in acceptance and we're clear of thoughts, but we're not.
Correct.
Like it's we, acceptance doesn't mean, for me anyway, that I accept it and I'm not thinking anything negative. That it doesn't work.
Agreed. So I always say when I sit in acceptance, it doesn't mean I like what has happened, what is happening or might happen, but I sit in acceptance because it is what it is. And again,
Yeah.
that's what takes me to the next concept. So let's say we're going along the lines and we want to be the observer. The next concept in the paradigm is be the observer. From the observer standpoint, when I'm in the discomfort and my eyes are closed, there are several things that I picture. You can picture your thoughts and your feelings and your emotions. You can picture them going by as a parade because you
Mm,
become the viewer. You can picture them as a movie. You can see the movie playing out and you're in the audience watching your life as a movie. You're observing it. That creates just microspace. Some people like to visualize them as clouds in the sky and each cloud is something. For me, when I'm really in that swirl, I become the eye of the hurricane and I sit
mm,
in the center and I'm in the center of this swirling mass of
right.
memories, ideas, and even talking about it because it happens frequently. It's an emotional release. But what happens is I realize when I'm in the center of that, while and I want to be very clear with this, so thank you for pointing this out, while I have thoughts, feelings, and emotions, while I sit in acceptance and may not like it, when I am at the eye of the storm and everything's swirling around me, it softens the sword. The sword's not as sharp. The knife's not as sharp. It doesn't cut as much. And I can say, let me create some space. For me, creating space from these concepts of I'm not worth it or I'm not good enough, whether you want to call that a thought, a belief pattern, doesn't matter. I was talking to a friend who labeled herself as someone with social anxiety. And she's like, I never thought of that as a thought. I just thought that's who I was. And I said, well, it's a construct that you inadvertently buy into, but when you create space, you can question it. So when we're the observer, we're able to say, you know what, this is happening. And it's an aspect of me. And I'm kind of like swirling my hand because it's an aspect of me. They're intertwined, but it's not my true self. And I also say the point of the paradigm is that we become aware of our ego, which is false self, which keeps us out of present moment. What happens when we're attached to our ego? We usually start telling ourselves a story, and we usually start traveling to the past with regrets or worries and anxiety for the future. So we're not in present moment. So when we sit in acceptance, we try to come back to present moment saying it is what it is. But you're still saying to me, rightfully so, I don't like this. Yeah, I'm observing. So now what do I do?
So my observing is if I'm just doing it now, I can see myself sitting like I do when I meditate. And then I can feel myself lifting. So I'm looking at myself meditating. So I'm above me. And I can see all of these thoughts coming out of my head as the observer. And those thoughts are like, you know, who are you to do this? Why is that happening? And I get what you're saying, because as soon as we lift up, I can see those thoughts coming out. They're not in me, like they're in me, but they're coming out. It's like this, you know, the inner critic is coming out. And you're right, there is that bit of relief almost when you actually observe to go, oh, and it almost gives you that space to breathe, right? You're not as consumed and it's not in your face all the time. So I like that you
That's
can.
the space you just created. You in this live, this is happening live,
Yeah,
everybody.
feel it. Yeah.
In this moment, as you pictured yourself above and seeing the thoughts come out, you just created microspace. And that
Yeah.
microspace is small. And so today, that microspace that you can't even measure over time grows. Now your thoughts are coming out and you're observing, you're above them. And when you observe them the way you are, there's that separation, but you bring up a valid point. Hey, Scottie, these are the same thoughts I had yesterday. They're the same thoughts I had 6 months ago. And they ruminate, they repeat, they circle, they're pervasive. What do I do? And what I used to do is I used to suppress, repress, avoid, numb, distract. My numbing agent of choice was drinking, and I would drink until the thoughts went away, or I would do an activity, or I would distract, and I would try to keep them pushed down. And we're going to skip surrender and go to lean in and let go. And the reason I say lean in and let go is similar to something you said earlier. I am physically sitting, my feet firmly planted. I know I'm in a chair, on the couch, sitting up in bed, wherever I feel grounded. And with lean in and let go, we now start letting the thoughts come up. The thousands of thoughts. So humans have, depending on what literature you read, there's some new literature coming out, which the numbers are lower. Older literature says humans have between 60 to 80,000 thoughts a day.
Yeah.
And 90% of those thoughts are the same each and every day.
Right. Yeah.
So when you have 90,000, when you have 60 to 80,000 thoughts and 90% of those are the same and ruminate each and every day, that's overwhelming. And now you're telling me, let them come up? Yes. Lean in. I physically lean forward. And the reason I lean forward is because I'm mentally preparing to let this come up. And I had a situation that I will share here, talking about vulnerability. The first time I appreciated lean in and let go was when I came out of a meditation and I had a memory of being told at a young age that I'm too much. And I didn't realize how that had
sat hidden in the corner of my body, bubbling for years, affecting so much about me. And it was told by a family member in the
Mm.
heat of the moment. And that passing comment stuck with me. And so here I am 40 years later after a meditation, and I had this feeling of I'm too much coupled with some worthlessness. And I'm like, wow, I'm going to do this. And so I took some slow, deep centering breaths and I said, let it come up and let it go. And I'm going back to the comment you made, which was brilliant in hindsight. So as you sit through this discomfort, I could push it back down and use my energy to push it back down, or I could let it come up.
And correct me if I'm wrong, I think we've got to work out what works for that person. Because for me, I can hear them, but then I hear them every day. So I'm just thinking as you were talking that what I could do to let it come up. And I think for me, it would actually be writing them down, because that would actually bring them to life as opposed to keep suppressing them. Because you can almost suppress it when you hear it.
Mm-hmm.
But when you physically take it out of your thought and you write it down and you look at it and you read it, that's confronting for me.
Whichever
That,
works.
so,
I think that's
yeah,
brilliant. For me, as this feeling came up, I was back in that childhood moment,
yeah.
feeling the overwhelm, feeling like I was too much, and I was very uncomfortable. At one point, I stood up. I had to
Mm,
shake it off. It was way too much energy. I took some slow, deep breaths and I sat back down and I just mentally said, I'm letting this go. And as the thought came up, I acknowledged it. I didn't negate it. I didn't
mm,
distract myself. I didn't numb, suppress, repress, avoid. Like those are all coping mechanisms because we don't want these feelings coming up. And so as this thought came up and the associated feelings are coming with it, the emotions are coming with it, I
yeah.
slowly took a breath in and a breath out and I focused on my breath and I said, we're letting this come up. And I want to say after 2 to 3 minutes, it felt like a 10 of 10.
Mm,
And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, this huge energy release happened. And I'm like, whew. And I'm like, whoa, that left me. Now, caveat, it left me, but it became a 6 of 10 instead of a 10 of 10.
yeah.
And about a
Yeah.
month later, the same thing came up for me. And I did the exact same thing. I'm like, here it is again. So it's not that the first time you do this, let's say
Mm,
you have that thought of, who am I to be starting this new business? And there might be a side story memory from childhood or young adulthood that is associated around that. So either can be let go, but usually there's some backstory, and the backstory might come up. For me, it was probably what I would call a light emotional trauma because I held on to it for so many years and it affected me, but it wasn't severe trauma. And I do want to put that caveat out there. If you have severe trauma, this is not something that you do on your own.
on
I
your
am
own.
not a
Yeah.
mental health provider. I'm not a trained therapist. I am trained as a physician assistant. I've worked in healthcare, but I want to be very clear. This is not medical advice. This is not mental health advice. This is a paradigm to help you when you're struggling. But there are times with severe depression, anxiety, mental illness, trauma, where you do need professional mental health support and you should get it.
Yeah.
Meditation and wellness are no substitute. But that being said, for me, I knew this was something I could let go. This concept is heavily, heavily influenced by many, many great authors that I've read. One of the most influential is David Hawkins, and his book is
Mm,
called Letting Go.
yeah.
So other authors that I've read in wellness, whether it be Pema Chodron, Thich Nhat Hanh, Wayne Dyer, have said similar things, but David Hawkins wrote an entire book about it. It's a fascinating book. And as these feelings come up, we let go. And the next time it happened, it was a 6 of 10. And now
Mm,
it'll pop up every so often. And it's like a 1 or a 2. And it just doesn't have the effect on me. So it's not that we forget the experience. it's that the emotional attachment we have. So again, going back to concept 2, the attachment we have with it, the emotional attachment lessens, and it doesn't affect our daily life. So now I know that I'm not too much. I'm not. I might not resonate with you, whoever you are, but that doesn't mean I'm too much. And it doesn't mean you're too much for me. It just means we might not resonate. So it changes everything.
And I think also just again reflecting as you're talking, that this whole sitting and observing, letting those feelings come up without, wanting to numb or distract, you might have to do that a couple of times. So again, like you said, as much as we've got this paradigm when we step through, and this is the power, I think, of having a coach with you, is you might go, right, Ush, for the next 3 weeks, we're just going to sit in this phase of the paradigm where I want you to continuously observe those thoughts, sit with the discomfort, and see what comes up for you, because doing it once might be foreign. Doing it a couple of times, you might get more insights into what that is. And for me, I don't have that deep rooted trauma to this situation. This is purely for me just
exactly
a self-belief. So like you said, for me it might have to be sitting with it a few times, working out what's coming up, and then witnessing it. Whereas again, when we do this, we want to almost bypass that, because it's just it's that discomfort, it's that uncomfortable feeling, and then we end up in that same loop, don't we, to go, well, haven't sat with it and the same thoughts are coming, the 90%, like you said, every day we're thinking the same things. It's been so good and really refreshing actually to step through your thought process of the awareness that I have these thoughts, and then to actually sit with that, that feeling and the discomfort in that acceptance, knowing the thoughts are still going to come, right? In that acceptance piece. And then almost stepping myself out of my own body to observe what's happening to me in that moment. And I do have one question, because when I was going through that as you were talking and I was physically doing the observing, it did feel really good to detach. Like there is that, I don't know what it is. There's this feeling of like lightness when I sort of lifted myself up to see myself, if that makes sense. And I know you said it's that micro space, but what do we do in that space to leverage the gap that we've got from our thoughts? Because like you said, we are going to connect again to our thoughts, quite quickly, because it's still a muscle that we're, practicing. But I'm just thinking, when that did feel really good, what should I be doing in that feeling really good moment? Should I be taking action? Should I just sit with it? Should I don't know, what do I do in that space?
You let it be, because that is true self. The lightness you described is what I described, the energy, the emotional energy leaving, that I was no longer, I'm too much. That narrative no longer had the emotional energy. The thought, the story might come back up, but the emotional energy isn't as heavy. So we sit in that space. And then what happens when the thoughts come back? We come back to the paradigm. And the first time you go through the paradigm, it's almost like, okay, I know all these 9 concepts. Like, I didn't create the 9 concepts. Let's be very clear. I put them into a framework that is exactly as you said, it's that roadmap. So I love your question, because you also know the answer. And if we want to create that space and grow that space, 2 words, Vedic meditation.
Yeah.
So,
well, you're right, because that feeling you get in meditation is exactly that, but just for a bit of a longer period of time.
Yes.
So you're right. And actually, I'm glad you just made that common sense link there. So for me, would be in that moment to go, right, I'm going to meditate now.
Yes. I've done that. Oh, I love that you said it that way. I came out of some of these experiences, said, now it's time that I meditate to let the dust settle.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. But the doer in me, because I'm a doer, what do I do that's going to help me take right action to my new business?
Beautiful. So as we grow the space and as we let go, we can surrender.
Yeah. Okay.
And when we're surrendering, it doesn't mean it doesn't mean we don't act. It doesn't mean we don't make choices. Surrendering, to me, the way that I describe it, we think through our intellect, we can solve any problem, fix anything, and just if we do hard enough, it'll work. You're right. You can eventually get the square peg into the round hole. You can. You might break whatever you're hitting it into, or the wood might chip away. You might be able to do that and say, look I did it. At what cost? So for me, this is when I float between the concepts, but I would go to surrender and saying, you know what? I'm surrendering my intellect for a moment to see if an answer can come to me by letting go. And surrender and letting go are similar, but I use them differently. But I will say, when you surrender, you let go, which is kind of a letting go of my intellectual control to see if I get that, what I call nudge. In Vedic meditation, we call it charm. But for me, I say, what's that nudge? To say, what's the next step for my new business?
Yeah. And look, I really like the concept of surrender. Like I really resonate with it. And I look at surrender as you can still take action from a place of surrender, which feels better than taking action from a place of resistance and control. That's how I look at it. Some people think surrender means apathy, throw your hands up in the air, you're quitting. For me, surrender is actually an energetic space that feels peaceful. So for me to work and take action from a place of surrender feels in flow. So for me, that's what surrender means. And you're right. Like, I think a lot of people have that misconception of surrender as something quite negative, like you've just kicked the can down the road or you don't give a shit. Yeah, but for me, it's still, because I'm such a doer, I still want to be able to take action. Yeah, does that make sense? But from a place of surrender, which feels really good. Like, it feels good.
100%.
It feels in flow.
And I like that you use the word flow, because flow to me means moving forward.
Yeah.
We're engaged. It just means how you described it. And I have a new quote on how to surrender. I'm going to go back and pull that quote from you, because the way you said it was so eloquently, and it's so true. Surrendering doesn't mean I don't care. Surrendering doesn't mean I'm apathetic. Surrender doesn't mean, well, I'm throwing my hands up in despair. No, I care so much that I can't see the clear answer. And the analogy I give for surrender is, I had a work project, high pressure, and I'm a high delivering person. So I could push, I could produce, and I hit a wall one day and I'm like, if I just keep pushing, I know I'll get the right answer. I'll get what I need. And again, square peg, round hole. Eventually you could probably do it.
Yeah.
And I'm like, you know what? I'm going to take my own advice. I don't have an answer for this. And I had to walk away. And I had to walk away for an entire day. It was towards the end of the day. I wanted to get it done and have it be over with, to check the box for the day. And I'm like, you know what? Go home. It's a long day. Went home, did my evening meditation, went to bed, woke up, got into work the next day. Boom. The answer was there. My surrender was just saying, I'm not going to answer this in the next 20 minutes when it's not due. Go home and come back. I had a refreshing moment. And so surrender can look, and I love your perspective that these terms can mean different things to different people. And surrender for me meant, I'm going to finish this tomorrow instead of forcing myself. Again, my intellect said I can do it. It's letting go of that intellect, saying, I'm going to step away. I have time and I'll get to it tomorrow. I walked in, there was my answer.
Yeah. And it's funny because like, I'm quite visual, and the visual I've got of surrender is like, you're on this tiny boat and you're rowing. And when you're in surrender, you're rowing in peace, calm waters. And when you're not in surrender, you're still trying to row in this turbulent waves. And, 30 minutes later, you're pretty much in the same place as you were, even though you've taken action. You feel more frustrated. You feel like, you feel more tired. You feel energetically depleted. Whereas still rowing in that place of surrender and there's calm water, you're going to go so much further, right? In that 30 minutes of rowing. So yeah, it's just changing. And I think you're right around use the paradigm in the way it needs to. So if in that place of surrender, that inner critic comes up, then go back into observer, right? That's what I would what I would do is go back into observer in that moment in time, use that little micro space, feel good, surrender, meditate, do what you need to do, write notes. It's almost like a circuit breaker, isn't it, really, to connecting to those thoughts as if it's you and really just stepping back. Yes,
The center of the paradigm intentionally is being true self and present moment. The self, you are in that. And one thing you said with surrender that I say a lot of times, I was told this many years ago early on in my administrative career, is I was always rowing upstream. And one of my coworkers like, drop the oars. Yeah. And when you drop the oars, it goes back to what you said, we go towards flow. I can row upstream until I'm exhausted because my intellect says I can. When I surrender, it just means I'm going to drop the oars and look at things from a different perspective, or maybe act on things differently. And then advancing on drop the oars, I mentally picture the boat dissolving and I'm the water, be the water. And I know you've heard that, Ush. We talk about this in Vedic training, be the water. Just the water will take you where it needs to take you, which then will tie you back into acceptance. Okay, I have to trust that this is going to work out. And I'm going to get the next right action. Like once I surrender and stop rowing, that next day when I came into work, I had to finish the project, but the answer was there. And my next right action, I was able to complete it and get it turned in, and it worked out great.
Love that.
All right. So that is going to conclude part 1 of today's podcast, and we'll be back next week with the second part of Ush's and my conversation around Possley's paradigm. So as always, thank you for listening and wishing you the best on your wellness journey.